Again, I'm Jim Van Epps, President of the Savannah Council and host for this evening's presentation by retired Ambassador Robert O. Blake, former Senior Advisor to U.S. Special Envoy for Climate Secretary John Kerry, speaking on U.S. diplomacy and climate change, global challenges. To begin, our sponsors for tonight are Kreitz, which we have talked about before because they are continuing platinum sponsor, and we're very grateful to Kreitz, our local dealer for Buick, GMC, BMW, Mercedes, and Sprinter vans. Also, we appreciate the sponsorship of Morris and Templeton, designing a commercial insurance package. They provide personal attention and informed guidance that they believe every client deserves. And they've been doing this since 1981. This independent agency has proudly offered personal advice on car, business, life, and high-valued home insurance to clients in Georgia, communities surrounding Atlanta, Savannah, and Hilton Head. And our third sponsor is a new sponsor this evening, and that's Carriage Trade Public Relations. And for over 25 years, Carriage Trade Public Relations has helped businesses increase their visibility, credibility, and, the positive word of mouth in the community. So thank you to our sponsors. And at this point, to get into the program, I'm going to ask Ambassador Blake, one of our directors, to introduce Ambassador Blake. Ambassador Silverman to introduce Ambassador Blake. So. No, I didn't. You're right. And this is thanks, Larry. This is the schedule for the rest of the year. And note that the next one is February 22nd. But right now, those are projected, and they look like great topics to me. But thank you, Larry, for bringing that forward. And let me introduce then Ambassador Larry Silverman.
Thank you very much, Jim. Welcome, everyone. Glad to see so many people here, especially glad to see the students here. Welcome to all of you. It really is a pleasure for me to be able to introduce Ambassador Blake to you this evening. Jim mentioned that he has been senior advisor to Secretary Kerry. Bob was recently at what's called the COP28 Climate Change Worldwide Summit in Dubai in December. He and 79,000 other delegates, and he can talk a little bit about what they were able to achieve. But some of it. You have his bio there. Bob was in the Foreign Service for 31 years. I succeeded him in one position on the Turkey desk officer. But Bob has been your ambassador to Indonesia, your ambassador to Sri Lanka, your Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, our Deputy Chief of Mission in India, and as an ambassador, I will gladly say, to me, this is the most impressive part of his background because he was voted Deputy Chief of Mission of the Year. From all over the world, he was considered our best Deputy Chief of Mission. And that's the CEO, COO, whatever else you want to say about making the trains run on time in any embassy. Yes, the ambassador may be out front, but the Deputy Chief of Mission really makes things work, and Bob was our best in India. And now, as Jim mentioned, he's at McLarty Associates Consultancy, where they have just, at Bob's, can I say urging? I don't know, encouragement, and certainly organization, created a climate practice within this consulting company because, frankly, companies need the advice how to deal with new regulations, which are going to be probably never-ending, but how they navigate their ways and how to help U.S. business. Bob has been, when I went to see him shortly after I retired, I remember sitting in his office, and he was talking about, he's worked on Asia for so long and other places, but this long-standing passion he had for the environmental issue and the groups that he's worked with over the years is a real dedication to the issue and saving us from climate change and other environmental issues before it was quite so fashionable, I think. So I'm very appreciative of that. And he's, now that he's in the private sector, he has still been advocating for greater diplomatic activity on the part of the U.S. government in support of climate policy, which means getting allies and maybe countries who are not allies on board with us. And lastly, I will say that he really practices what he preaches, because after he retired, he became part of a team that worked with with U.S. officials, with Japanese officials and others, to bring Indonesia on board to create something called the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is very important because Indonesia is a very important economy and therefore important in the climate picture. So you really are hearing from one of our best experts on the subject, freshly back from Dubai, and it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Ambassador Bob Blake.
Things first, can you all hear me? Does that work? Yeah. All right. Well, Larry, thank you so much for that extraordinarily kind introduction, which I don't really deserve, but it's really a pleasure to be here. And I must say, you all are very fortunate to have Larry Silverman directing your programs, because he's a man of many accomplishments himself and has a huge reservoir of friends in the State Department still, and he I'm sure, do a fantastic job of bringing some of our best and brightest down here to Savannah. I want to just, first of all, thank you, all of you, for the invitation to come to your lovely city. We've just suffered through an incredible cold spell up in Washington. I heard it got a little bit chilly even down here, but nothing like what it was in Washington. But you know, even though I'm a native Washingtonian, it's really nice to get out of Washington every once in a while. And you know, whenever I was back from my various overseas assignments, I would be amused to hear other politicians make jokes about Washington. And my favorite was Bob Gates, who was, you know, legendary guy, head of the CIA and the Secretary of Defense and all that. And every speech that he gave, he would start by making jokes about Washington. And his favorite one-liner was that he loves Washington because it's the only place in the world where you could see a prominent person walking down Lover's Lane holding his own hand. And he would go on and on with sort of a series of one-liners about. I'm sorry. My technical assistant here will.
If I'm your technical assistant, you're in trouble.
So let me see if I can make this work here. Oh, let me get rid of that. So anyway, I'm not going to make any more jokes about Washington, D.C. You've heard them all, I'm sure. But I am here to talk a little bit about climate change, because as Larry said, it is a passion of mine. And I worked, before I even joined the Foreign Service, I worked for a group called the Natural Resources Defense Council and worked a lot on environmental issues there. And frankly, while I was in the State Department, it really was never that fashionable. And it was, the area of the environment was sort of a backwater. And so it just wasn't that an attractive place to work, so I never really did it until much later in my career when I was ambassador and had a chance to do things. But I want to talk about climate because it's one of these really, really important issues that one of our former bosses, the great Bill Burns, who's now the head of the CIA, but was Deputy Secretary of State and done all kinds of other things, a wonderful guy. And he calls climate one of these problems without passports. And I think that's a really good way to characterize it, because it's a global problem and you need global solutions, and every single country and really every single person's got to work on it. And I think all of you know that 2023 is probably going to be remembered as the year when people finally began to see firsthand around the world how climate change is really impacting our climate in real and unprecedented ways, and really more, frankly, than even the scientists predicted. And so I'll just give you a few examples just to sort of refresh your memory. In Phoenix, a heat wave went on for 31 consecutive days, where temperatures exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit, leading to 600 heat-related deaths just in one community around Phoenix. So that's one of them. The head of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, recently said that his agency used to have only high operational tempo during the summer months when all the hurricanes would come through this part of the world. And now FEMA works all year round because there are just crises everywhere that they have to deal with, and most of them are climate related. And indeed, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, I read a report by their director a couple of weeks ago. He said that last year marked the highest ever number of billion-dollar plus natural disasters that were climate-induced in the United States, and that was 28. And that exceeded the previous record of 20 that was set in 2020, so not that long ago. So the pace of these disasters is increasing, and the cost of these disasters is increasing. Another one that I found particularly horrifying, we all think of the Amazon as being one of the lushest rainforests in the world with plentiful rain, and yet the rain has been in such short supply that one of the rivers in the central part of the Amazon actually dried up to the point where navigation was no longer possible for several months of the year, which I thought was just amazing. I'm sorry, I went forward a little bit too fast here. I wanted to show you a picture. This picture here was another one. This is a picture in Libya. And, we all think of Libya as being in the middle of the desert, not too much rain. They had an unprecedented 2 days of rain that caused massive flooding that killed 4,000 people. And they're still counting the dead. There are 10,000 missing. So it's probably well more than that. And you can see the destruction that caused. And of course, we all know about the Antarctic, where we read every day about the stories of how fast the glaciers are melting in Greenland and elsewhere. And closer to you all heard, I'm sure, about a buoy in the Florida Keys that measured water temperatures exceeding 100 degrees for the first time, which is really kind of the temperature you get in a commercial hot tub. And that's, you can imagine the difficulties that fish and other marine life had. And then the other one I wanted to just show were these Canadian wildfires that were, again, unprecedented in scope. And they released in a few weeks 3 times the amount of carbon dioxide that all of the heating and cooling and driving and cooking that Canadians produce in a typical year. So these fires have a huge impact on climate change, and they're just getting worse and worse, not just in Canada, but also in the western part of the United States. So I guess just to start, the key message is that climate change is already here, and we really got to be doing something about it. And I was struck when I went to Dubai. The UN Secretary General Guterres, who's very passionate on this issue, characterized 2023 not as the year of global warming, but as the year of global boiling. And I think that was probably a fairly apt characterization. So the question is, what is the world doing to try to address these problems and address climate change? And as you probably know, since 1995, the world has been holding these conference of parties, the COPs as we call them, to catalyze international action to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm not going to go through them all, but let me just touch on a few of the really important ones. One of the really important ones was in 2015 in Paris, because it was there that the world's 195 nations first agreed to the famous 1.5 degree centigrade target that you always hear about. And why does that matter? Why do people care about 1.5 degrees centigrade? First of all, that's the one. And I'll just quickly run through this. But basically, the scientific consensus is that increases of temperature above 1.5 degrees centigrade by the year 2100 are going to lead to irreversible melting of the ice sheets in Greenland, Antarctica. They're going to lead to incredible sea level rises as a result of that. And they're going to lead to things like stresses on food production, insect-borne diseases such as malaria and dengue fever. And, you know, we're really seeing a lot of those already. But these two slides here kind of show the difference between what you're going to get of 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees versus 3 degrees, and why it really, really is important to address these and try to keep to the 1.5 degree target. I won't go through all that because I don't want to bore people too much with figures. But Larry mentioned that I lived in India, and you know, India is one of the countries that's really going to be most affected by climate change. When you talk about things like heat-related deaths, water scarcity, rises of disease, declines in food production, India is going to experience all of that. And we're already seeing that, indeed, in many parts of India. So how has the world been doing to try to fix this? If I see there's some students here in the crowd. I'm really glad to see all of you. I'd probably give the world about a C+ so far. There's been some progress. I mean, I think it's important to realize that when the whole COP process started, scientists at that point said that the world was probably going to heat to about 4 degrees centigrade by the year 2100. Sort of depending on how you measure it now, we're probably about half of that. And maybe a little bit less if all of the pledges that are done, and I'll get into that in a minute. But so we've made progress. It's important to say that, because sometimes all you hear is sort of gloom and doom and nothing's possible, and that's not true. Work has been done, and work can be done, and that's going to really be the focus of what I want to talk to you about. The other one I want to take you back to was the COP26 in Glasgow, which was just a couple of years ago in Scotland. And it was there that countries realized that it was not enough to try to set targets to 2050, because that just gave governments and everybody else too much of an excuse to not do anything and just delay action. So they decided at that COP that countries had to set targets to meet specific targets by the year 2030. And that those needed to be really binding targets to the extent they could be. And so the Glasgow Pact, for the first time, agreed on the need to reduce global CO2 emissions by at least 45% by 2030, which was a big number. And that that the goal then was to reach what they called a net zero pollution-free world by 2050. And that, in turn, would achieve that famous 1.5 degrees centigrade target. Now, after COP26, I was already working for John Kerry, so I'd go to his staff meetings, and he would yell at all of us about all the things that had to be done. And one of the things he used to say was that because of the agreements at COP, 65% of the largest economies of the world had committed to 2030 targets. So that left about 35% that hadn't. And so that's where he figured we had to focus our efforts. And that's why I was brought back in, for example, to help on Indonesia. Indonesia was one of the countries that did not have a 2030 target, and in fact didn't even have a 2050 target. And so they came up with this idea of these just energy transition partnerships that I'll talk about in a minute. But so anyway, just keep that figure in mind of 65 versus 35. There was still a very large number of countries that hadn't done enough. On the good side, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, which tracks energy developments around the world, and he's a very good guy and a very smart guy, said that if all of the commitments and all of the initiatives that had been made in Glasgow were actually implemented by 2050, and of course that's a very big if, that the world would be able to limit global warming to 1.8 degrees centigrade. So not 1.5, but still, reasonable progress. And then after the one in Sharm el-Sheikh 2 years ago, he revised that estimate a little bit lower because of some new commitments and said, the world, again, if all these commitments are implemented, we can get to 1.7 degrees centigrade. So a bit more progress, but still a lot of work to be done. And of course, all of these commitments have to be implemented. So let me just talk about some of the big challenges that I think. One is that emissions from the burning of fossil fuels, which comprise about 75% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So if you're going to really make progress on this, you've got to make progress to reduce these emissions of fossil fuels. And instead, if you look at the figures over the last 2 years, emissions from the burning of fossil fuels actually increased by about 1% in 2022 over 2021, and then increased another 1.1% in 2022 from the beginning of 2022 to the end of 2023. So in other words, the world is going backwards. Now, a lot of that is because of the problems in Ukraine, but still, it just shows that a lot of work has got to be done. And then, as I mentioned, another really huge problem has got to be implementation. Everybody talks and makes these grand announcements at these COPs, but they really don't mean anything unless somebody sort of holds their feet to the fire. And that's, in a way, where John Kerry sort of came in. And I think one of the great things that he really worked on. And I really admired him from afar. Of course, I only worked with him mostly on Indonesia. But he kept up an unbelievably rigorous schedule of travel, just going from country to country to the real laggards of the world to sort of really hound them about what they were doing to implement their own pledges. How could the United States and other countries help to mobilize finance to help them with whatever problems they were experiencing, and basically really hold their feet to the fire to make sure that they were going to be doing more. And so I really admire him, and I think we're going to miss him. I think many of you know he's announced his retirement is going to help in the Biden campaign, but it's a very hard thing to. He's going to be a very, very hard person to replace. So coming to Dubai, the most recent COP that was just a couple of months ago that I attended, the headline out of Dubai was that delegates agreed for the very first time, which was good, that countries should begin transitioning away from fossil fuels. Now, that may sound like a sort of mealy-mouthed, mushy, bureaucratic speak, but in fact, it was actually a very, very important thing because the Saudis, and to an extent even the UAE itself, had resisted that until the very last days of the conference. They did not want to see this language. And they had blocked it all the way along and in all of the preparatory meetings and so forth. So in the end, when they finally did agree to at least this transition language, that was considered a real breakthrough and will send, it was believed, and I believe it, an important market signal to a lot of the fossil fuel companies and others who use fossil fuels that it is important to begin this transition. Some other important things were announced. Countries agreed in general that the world needs to triple renewable energy capacity, and already a lot is being done in that regard. And another one that you might not hear as much about is methane. Methane is one of the most potent greenhouse gases. And if you can make progress on methane, that's going to make a huge difference to the overall climate effort. And so particular attention was given to methane this year, and particularly to countries like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, who are very large oil and gas producers, but have not done enough to address methane emissions. And so they were finally brought on board and joined something called the Global Methane Pledge, which is a pledge to cut worldwide methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And again, that's in many cases starting from almost zero. So, and importantly, those countries have the resources. And in fact, one of, was mentioned, I work for McLarty Associates. One of our clients is a company called GHGSat. And what they do is they measure methane from outer space. And they're able to tell where there are leaks in pipelines, for example. And so they have hired us to basically help them with introductions to the Minister of Energy of Turkmenistan and the Minister of Energy of Kazakhstan and a lot of the similar ministers in the Middle East and North Africa where the most significant methane emissions are. So we're going to be doing that for the next year, which will be a really interesting project. On the finance side, everybody agrees that developing countries, who, let's be honest, are responsible for a tiny, tiny fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions that we now have in the atmosphere. And yet they're the ones, as I mentioned with India, who are going to really bear the brunt of climate change. So I think everybody agrees that these developing countries need finance to invest in renewable energy and clean energy, and also to invest in what's called adaptation. So how can they protect themselves from all of these changes that are going to be taking place? But for years and years, it's been a real problem to get countries to agree, including our own, by the way, to provide finance for developing countries. And this year at COP, for the very first time, the overall consensus was that there should be created what's called a loss and damage fund. And for the first time, that was capitalized at $700 million. $700 million is a tiny drop in the bucket of what is needed, but at least now this is created. It's going to be operating under the UN for the moment, which is good. The UN has very good technical experts who can do this kind of thing. So the next COP that will be in Baku, the focus will be on how can we really now ramp up financing for that. And I'll talk a little bit later about that, but it's a major challenge because in our own country, in the European Union and elsewhere, you see more and more populist leaders who are really not interested in whatever problems there are in other parts of the world. They want to focus on what are the problems in their own country. And that's fair enough. I mean, you can't criticize them for that, and yet there are all these major issues. So after Dubai, where are we? Have we done enough? And obviously the answer is no. And who are those that are going to be most affected? When I was ambassador in Sri Lanka, I was also accredited as ambassador to the Maldives. Everybody thinks, oh, what a cushy job. That's really nice. Well, the Maldives, it is a lovely place. But while I was there, they had some pretty serious issues. One of them was, I don't know if you remember the famous tsunami that hit Indonesia. Well, believe it or not, tiny little Maldives is pretty far away from Indonesia. They were submerged by that tsunami as well. And they're a low-lying country. The highest point in the Maldives is probably about here. And you can imagine the tsunami just washed over everything in the Maldives. It was just a brief rise in sea level, and then it subsided. But it was a huge problem. Why? Because every single freshwater well was flooded with seawater. So that itself was just a major, major problem. Never mind all the other flooding and other things. So they experienced sort of firsthand what sea level rise is going to mean for them, and they're very scared about it. And they were highly critical of the outcomes in Dubai, and just felt that there were far too many loopholes that had been left for oil and gas companies and for these large companies in the Middle East and Central Asia that are still producing, and that just a transitioning language is not enough. What was needed was language on phase out, and those countries didn't want to touch the phase out word. So they also were critical of the emphasis on what's called carbon capture and storage, CCUS. And CCUS is a good thing. Everybody believes that carbon capture should be part of the solution. The argument is, should it be enough of a crutch that oil and gas companies should be allowed to continue to just produce as before? And obviously the answer is no. They should be looking to reduce their emissions over time, and in addition invest in CCS. And some of the most progressive ones are in fact doing that. The other one that they were upset about was the implicit language in the declaration that natural gas should continue to play a role in the energy mix. This is a very sensitive issue, and this is a very sensitive issue in our own country as well. President Biden is facing a difficult decision right now about several large LNG projects, and should they be approved. And of course, environmentalists are saying no, and others are saying, of course they should be, because we need them as a transition fuel. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think what's going to happen is he's going to require environmental impact statements on all these projects, and that will then kick the can down the road until the end of the election. And then somebody will make a decision, our new president, whoever that president is. Let me just mention one other thing that I think is important that gets hardly any attention, but it could be really a major big deal. And that's the carbon market. You often hear about how countries should be trying to set a carbon price or set a carbon tax of some sort. In most countries like ours, that's far too controversial. You know, something like that would never get through Congress. We can barely pass our own budgets, much less something major like a carbon tax. But what people are trying to do is to have the UN and the COP process create a carbon market framework. And this would make a really big deal because countries like Indonesia, where I served, they have vast forest reserves. And in many cases, they've been making a lot of progress to preserve those. And they haven't been able to benefit from that because there hasn't been a reliable carbon market out there. And so, and I'll just tell you one little anecdote. I met with a good friend of mine who runs the World Resources Institute program in Papua, which is the easternmost province of Indonesia, has huge forest reserves, very sparsely populated. And so I said to him, you know, I saw him at the UN in September. I said, you know, how's it going? He said, well, you want to know the good news or the bad news? I said, well, let's start with the good news. He said, well, the good news is that the leaders of Papua, the provincial leaders, have agreed to expand the amount of protected area in Papua from 30% to 70%. In 1 year, they've agreed to ramp that up, which is an amazing decision for them to make. I said, well, that's fantastic. So what's the bad news? He said, the bad news is they haven't been able to get a cent for it. And that's because there's no global carbon market yet. And there are companies like Amazon, for example, that has a huge digital footprint in Indonesia because they have all of they have all these data centers. And these data centers, of course, suck up electricity. And right now, the only electricity they can source is either coal or oil or natural gas, because there's just not enough renewable energy. And that's what we were working on with this JET-P agreement. But as a result of that, they have to offset all of those fossil fuel purchases if they want to continue to have their own 2050 target. They would love to be able to purchase carbon credits to protect Indonesian forests, but the market just doesn't exist right now. So if that market were to be established and to have integrity behind it so that people could measure it in a good way, it would make a huge difference to the countries like Indonesia, like the Congo, like Brazil, and others. And so carbon market is a really, really big deal, and you know, just keep that in the back of your mind because it is important. So far I've been a little bit kind of negative. I'd like to just sort of talk a little bit about some of the positive things that are happening that give me some hope and give me some encouragement. First of all, I think it's important. I'll talk a little bit about what countries are doing and a little bit about what companies are doing, because both of them are making a big impact. So here's a little trivia question for you. If I asked you what major economy has made the most progress in deploying renewable energy, in the last several years? What would you think? It's not the United States. China, exactly. China has been the renewable energy superstar. They have deployed as much solar capacity last year as the entire world did in 2022. And they're expected to add nearly 4 times more than the EU and 5 times more than the United States between 2023 and 2028. So they are moving ahead extraordinarily rapidly on the renewable energy front, and that's a good thing. That doesn't mean we're standing still. You've all heard about the Inflation Reduction Act, and I think everybody at the COP where I was in Dubai gave the United States very, very high marks for the Inflation Reduction Act, and they believe that it will have a really important impact and will enable us to reduce our emissions to goals consistent with the 2050 target. So that's a really big deal. I'm sorry, I've forgotten about all my slides here. Oh, that's an example of an island that's about to go underwater. That's in Tuvalu in the Pacific. Investments. Oh, so this is the IRA. So these are some of the investments that the Department of Energy is making that are going to make quite an important difference in terms of helping people to weatherize their homes, helping with electric vehicles, the charging systems in particular, but also buying, of course, expanding the grid. We have a major problem with our grid here in the United States, and so forth. And as here, this slide, what has actually happened? They've deployed so far $370 billion in investment and added 210,000 clean energy jobs. So that's a pretty nice record and something that's impressive. The EU likewise has a very good target, and they're doing well. They've got a binding plan in place to cut emissions by 55% from 1990 levels by 2030 and reach, again, net zero by 2050. You probably remember there were some really important elections in Brazil that brought Lula back to power, and he's very committed to stopping deforestation and ramping up renewable energy. Australia, likewise, was a real laggard for a while, believe it or not. Now they have a prime minister who's very much committed to the climate fight. And as I mentioned, big, large emitters, really thanks to efforts by John Kerry and others, Indonesia, Vietnam, Mexico, Egypt, all have strengthened their targets very substantially over the last several years. So those are all really, really important milestones that are taking place. And then, again, I mentioned the global methane pledge. 150 countries now have signed on to the global methane pledge. So that's basically 3/4 of the world who are trying to slash those emissions. So there is progress on the country front. On the energy front, just to talk a little bit about renewable energy here, again, there's strong momentum on the development of renewable energy, not just in China, but globally. And a lot of that, of course, is because the costs of solar and wind in almost all countries around the world are now lower than the cost of fossil fuels. But likewise, you're seeing the costs of some of these newer technologies like green hydrogen and battery storage, for example, are becoming a really, really important part of the energy mix and will become even more important over time. The IEA that I talked about earlier, the International Energy Agency, in its most recent report found that the world added 50% more renewable energy capacity in 2023 just over the last year, and it's a huge increase. And every single year they set new records like that, so you can see the curve that's going up. But that needs to continue because it's not going to happen otherwise. The other, I think, important progress, and this is something of relevance to all of you, is the growth in demand of electric vehicles. I know that Hyundai is building a big EV factory here, and that's really great news. But worldwide, the sales of EVs and hybrids grew by 20% last year, and that was mostly because of growth in North America and China. And I know there's a little bit of a slowdown here in the United States because the charging infrastructure is not as good as it could be. I own a Tesla, so the Tesla infrastructure is actually better than the other kinds of infrastructure, but still, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But that's one of the things that the IRA is working hard to address. The other thing that it's important to note is that companies are stepping up. I was very happy to see that Walmart made an announcement that they are going to put in EV charging capacity in almost all of their Sam's Clubs and Walmarts around the country, which is a huge deal because 90% of Americans live within 10 miles of a Walmart or a Sam's Club. So and I can tell you, I go up to Maine in the summer. There are no charging stations anywhere, but there is a Walmart. And so if I'd love to go to that Walmart and charge my car. And so I think I'll be able to do that now, which is going to be great. And here's another interesting trend that I think all of you will take advantage of. As people buy more electric vehicles, they're also buying solar panels and then little batteries for themselves, which is what I have. And so they're charging their car, but they're also developing their own little charging stations right there, and then selling their excess power back to the grid. And so I know that's great. I get a little money back from my utility for that. But I was really fascinated to read a story the other day about Hawaii, which is doing this on a grand scale. And the island of Oahu closed down their last coal-fired power plant in 2022. And they're going to rely entirely on wind and solar. And so everybody said, how are we going to be able to store that? And what's going to happen when it rains and when it's, there's no wind or whatever? And what they did is that they have set up these huge Tesla Megapack batteries, which are a very large number that they've aggregated together. And so these batteries are not only storing the solar and wind energy, but they're drawing from all of these electric vehicle owners power back in, so that when they need power, when let's say there's 5 days of rain or something like that, they can then buy the power back from all of these electric vehicle owners and people who have their own solar panels on their roofs and things like that. So there's a lot of this sort of interesting momentum that's now taking place in the energy markets that's, I find at least, very, very encouraging. That's sort of a good segue into some of the other things that are being done by American companies and by companies globally. The other kind of big global gathering that people talk about is the World Economic Forum in Davos that takes place every year in either the second or third or fourth week of January. So they just had the most recent one in Davos. So this is used to be where everybody went to talk about globalization. Last year, mostly everybody was talking about AI, and a little bit again about climate, because climate is important. But one of the interesting things is that every year, the WEF, as they call it, the World Economic Forum, they have their own little secretariat, and they survey business leaders to sort of see what's on their mind and what are their major concerns. And I thought this was very interesting. This is really hard to see. But let me just move up here for 1 second. So they asked them, what are your biggest concerns? So this year, for the last 2 years, number one is misinformation and disinformation, and that's been accelerated now by the deployment of AI, because AI is going to make that even harder to detect. But number two is extreme weather events induced by climate change, and then societal polarization, cyber, interstate conflict, inflation, the usual things. Then they ask them another interesting question. Okay, looking ahead 10 years, what are the things you're most concerned about? The top 4 are all climate related. Extreme weather events, critical change to Earth systems, biodiversity loss, natural resources shortages. So, and these are all the mainstream leaders, JP Morgan. I mean, these are not environmental extremists. These are, the hardcore business people. So they are very, very focused on climate change and what's going to happen, which is good. I was pleased to see that. So what's important is that these companies are not just wringing their hands and saying, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? They're actually taking action. And one of the measures of that is a great thing called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And this is an initiative by which companies commit to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions over a period of time to hopefully get themselves to be consistent with this 2050 1.5 degree centigrade target. And what's interesting now is that 4,000 companies around the world, and these are some of the largest companies in the world, have committed to science-based targets. And so what happens is you make a commitment, and then there's a technical committee of this group that goes in and analyzes it and makes sure that it's actually serious and that it's really going to achieve what it says it's going to achieve. And then they're either sent back for more work or they're approved. 2,300 have had their targets approved, and now they're in the process of implementing them. And these committees still monitor what's going on. And so Amazon, for example, was approved, and now they've been kicked out because the committee decided they weren't doing enough to actually implement their own pledges. So it's a pretty serious system. But it's interesting that if you look down the list of the 4,000, it's every single company that you can think of. I mean, I just picked out a few: Walmart, American Airlines, Nike, Apple. All of these companies have serious science-based targets. And they're doing this not because they're doing it out of some public relations thing. They're doing it because they understand that it makes economic sense for them to do it. Another really important one that I want to just mention is something called the First Movers Coalition. And this was actually a brainchild of John Kerry as well, with several other smart people. And they were focusing on what is called the hard-to-abate sectors. And these are sectors that have high emissions, but are not, those emissions are very, very difficult to reduce. And so he and all the people that came up with this idea said the only way we're ever going to be able to make progress in these sectors is to get the leading companies in each of those sectors to pool their efforts so that no one company is going to get competitive advantage or disadvantage from taking action on this. And together they will then invest in the innovation that needs to take place. And so this is called the First Movers Coalition. So you can see the sectors: aluminum, aviation, cement is a huge one, shipping, steel, trucking, carbon dioxide removal. So those are all areas where a lot of, so what's interesting is now 96 of the largest companies in the world have committed to joining one of these 7 sectors to make these investments that I talked about. And I'll just give you a few examples. Savannah is a major port. So I picked out Maersk. You've all heard of the Maersk, a huge shipping company. So they launched last year, as part of this initiative, the first green methanol-enabled container ship. So this giant container ship is going to be running on methanol, green methanol, for the first time, which is a really, really big deal. And of course, they're going to have to scale that now, but still, they've shown that it works. So now the challenge is to bring down the costs. And again, if they can get other shipping companies to invest, they'll be able to do that. And again, their goal is to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040, which would be pretty darn impressive. Another one that you might be interested in is Toyota. So you've got Hyundai coming here. Toyota's actually been criticized for not moving fast enough on electric vehicles, and that's a fair criticism. But for the several years running, they've been the largest car seller in the world, including last year. Toyota just a few weeks ago announced that they expect to be able to manufacture what they call next generation solid state batteries. So that instead of lithium batteries, is what you have most of the time, these are going to be solid state batteries. And what's interesting about it, so as an EV owner, we all worry about miles and how many miles you're going to get. So I get about 300 miles on my little Tesla. With these batteries, they'll be able to get, they say they'll be able to get 750 miles on a single charge, which would be pretty darn impressive. And even more impressive to me is they'll be able to get that charge in 10 minutes. So for me, it takes 45 minutes, sometimes longer. It depends how many other cars are charging and all that kind of stuff. So this is the kind of innovation that is now taking place. Now, there are a lot of people who are sort of poo-pooing this and saying this is not going to happen, this is going to be too hard. But Toyota is a pretty conservative company, so they don't generally make announcements like this unless they're fairly confident that it's going to happen. So I just say that as to show you that people are making these kinds of investments now because they make sense, they believe they're going to make money off it, but it's also going to help the planet. Let me just talk a little bit about U.S. diplomacy, because I saw that it was in the title of my speech. As I said, John Kerry has been we've been very fortunate to have John Kerry at the helm of our efforts. And, you know, he was in many ways born to the job. He had been Secretary of State for so long, but he was deeply committed to this. And so, for example, when I went out to Indonesia, you know, ambassadors, when you go into big countries like Kuwait or something like that, you get to go see the Secretary of State, and he gives you a letter of instruction. And this has been laboriously negotiated by, you know, 15 different bureaucracies. And so it's sort of a laundry list of all the things you're supposed to do, and human rights, religious freedom, you know, you name it, everything, in a place like Indonesia or India. And so he kind of waved this letter at me, and he said, you know, Bob, I've got all these things I'm supposed to talk to you about, but as far as I'm concerned, this was in 2013, 2 years before the Paris. As far as I'm concerned, there's only one thing I want you to work on, wagging his finger at me. He said, I want you to figure out how you're going to get Indonesia to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. And he said, I don't know how you're going to do that, but you're a smart guy, you'll figure it out. And then he sent me on my way, and that was it. I had about a 30-second meeting with him. And but, you know, I took him seriously. And if there's time, I can tell you about what we did. And we did a lot. We did a big sustainable palm oil initiative that got all the big palm oil companies in Indonesia, and they're the largest palm oil companies in the world, to agree to a fairly simple thing of, you know, they would not clear any more primary forests, they would not clear any more peatland, and they would grow any new palm oil on previously degraded land. And then it fell to me to go to the CEOs of all these companies and get them to agree to it, which they did. And anyway, the long and the short of it is, since then, in the last 6-7 years since then, Indonesia had more progress in reducing deforestation than any other country in the world, and because of these palm oil companies have done a really good job. So that initiative cost the U.S. government about $2,000 in terms of airfares for me to go talk to all these CEOs. But you know, it's the kind of thing that we can do as diplomats, because we have convening power. An American ambassador calls up the CEO of a big company, they'll actually listen. They'll say, oh, sure, you can come see me. And so we were able to do this kind of stuff. And I can tell you more about that if you're interested. But the other one that I did join, and he called me up, he remembered that, and he said, I get this call on my cell phone. It's like, Bob, and I didn't even know who it was. He was calling from the garage of the State Department, so it was like a terrible, you know, I couldn't even hear what he was saying. He said, I need your help, I said, yeah, who is this? John Kerry. Oh, yes, sir. And he said, I need your help. I'm starting up this Just Energy Transition Partnership in Indonesia, and I got all these really smart people working for me, but not a single one of them can get in to see a minister because they're all technical people. They don't know any of them. So I need you to come in and help, get this high-level access so that we can get these guys to do what we need them to do. And I said, well, sir, I got a full-time job already. I really can't leave that, but I'll give you a part-time. And he said, okay, deal. So I spent about 1.5 years working for him. It was really interesting. But he brought that kind of passion, and that was just one slice of what he was doing. Every trip that we went to Indonesia, he was then off to Vietnam and Mexico and India, and he just never stopped traveling. I sort of wonder why his wife didn't divorce him, because he was never around. But after that experience, I sort of said to Kerry, I said, I loved working for you, but we really have to do more to really institutionalize climate work at the State Department, because virtually everybody that was working for him was somebody from outside of government. There were experts from the think tank community all over the United States who loved John Kerry, and so they came to work for him. But that's not a way to sustain your business. They all want to leave, of course, once he leaves. So I think what we have to do is first of all, we have to create a separate climate bureau in the State Department. There is already a bureau called Oceans, Environment, and Science, OES, which is a great bureau, but they've got their hands full. I mean, they're doing all kinds of stuff on fishing, and they're doing all the international environmental negotiations of various kinds. They work on biodiversity, a lot of other stuff, and they're not staffed to do this. And climate, frankly, needs its own bureaucracy, and it also we need to really train people. There are climate positions now at most levels of the State Department, but there are only a few. And you take my example. I mean, I was somebody who was passionate about this, but I didn't want to work in it because there was no career track for me. So we need to create that career track. So he agreed with that. So we're trying now to get the positions set up in around the world so that there's a climate position in all these important embassies that I talked about, so that these guys can really drill down and work on that. And then, of course, all those people have got to be trained. So, it's not a matter of just sort of sending them out. They need the technical expertise to really get this kind of job done. And so some of that can be done at our Foreign Service Institute, and we can bring in smart people to train our Foreign Service officers. But I think we should also have people detailed out to companies that are doing cool stuff. Send people to Toyota for a year. Send people to Walmart and learn what they're doing. Send people to, all of these, to the World Resources Institute. And they'd love to have State Department people because they get a lot out of it on the other end when those people go back into government, because then they've got good contacts who can help them on things. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Let me just end on couple of quick things. I think there are a few things that could either slow us down or accelerate momentum. One is every single person that I talk to, if you said, okay, what's the greatest risk that the world faces in 2024? Every single one of them talked about Donald Trump. And I know probably a lot of Republicans here, and I'm not, I worked for Republicans and Democrats my entire life, so I'm totally nonpartisan. But the world is very worried about the fact that the United States might re-elect Donald Trump, in which case he would pull us out of the COP process again, probably, and we certainly wouldn't have somebody like John Kerry running around pushing countries to do things, because that's what they need. They need that kind of diplomacy. And so that's one thing that people are worried about. I think I tried to reassure people a little bit. I mean, I said, yes, it's true that if that happens, but don't forget that even when Trump was president, a lot of the climate work did continue. States like California and really all of the states along the West Coast went right on with what they were doing. And once California establishes a regulation, companies have to abide by those regulations. They're not going to have two separate standards, of one for California and one for the rest of the United States. So generally speaking, the California standard becomes the U.S. standard. And that really was the case in a lot of so yes, I think the election of Donald Trump would be a negative but it's not as catastrophic as everybody says. Now, that may be, I'm happy to hear other views if people disagree with me. Another risk, I think, is that even if President Biden is reelected, we have a huge problem of just the partisan divisions on Capitol Hill, where there's just complete gridlock on everything. It's very, very hard to get things done. And that probably will continue in the next Congress because the margins are so small in the Senate and in the House. And so it's so easy for extremists on either side to block legislation. And so it's very, very hard to get things done. And and that really matters for things like climate finance. And I worry about climate, but also worry about things like refugees. We have one of the largest refugee problems in the world now that we've ever had, and yet there's a growing level of selfishness in our country and in the European Union and elsewhere people don't want to pay for refugees. They don't want to have refugees coming into their country. They don't want to offer them jobs. And, and that's a problem. These, with climate change, you're going to see very large numbers of refugees in Africa, for example. If the EU is worried about what's happening now, it's going to be much worse in 10 years, and even much worse after that. So something's got to be done about that, and I worry that people are just putting their heads in the sand a little bit. And again, it's not just the United States, it's the European Union. We're seeing now the rise of far-right populism in a number of countries, including in some of our closest allies, France, Germany. Both the heads of state of both those countries are looking over their shoulder at Marine Le Pen and others, and who are gaining strength because of the immigration issue in both of those countries. So let me just end up. What people always ask me, particularly young people, what can we do as individuals? And there are a couple of really easy things that we can do. First of all, buy an electric vehicle. Another one is invest in for your heating system. That's one of the largest sources of. So buy a heat pump. That's the easiest thing because the heat pump can rely on electricity from the grid. I have a heat pump in my house. They're great. And you can put a little solar panel on your roof and power your heat pump that way. Reduce food waste. That's a big one. We waste a lot of food in the United States. We've probably 30% or more. There was a slide back there of all the food that's, and that all of that food is generating methane. And so even if you don't do that, at least compost your food waste, and then you can recycle it as soil. And then, believe it or not, 22% of greenhouse gases come from agriculture and deforestation. And a lot of that comes from the beef industry because forests have to be cleared to provide more pasture land in places like Brazil. So if we can reduce I'm not saying stop eating all meat, we love meat, but reduce the amount of beef that you eat, you can make a very big difference. And probably most important of all is just exercise your right to vote. And I say that particularly for the young people here. I have 3 daughters who are going to vote for the first time in 2024. So I'm making sure that they're all registered and that they're knowing the issues, and because the young people they tend to be very, very progressive, and they tend to be very knowledgeable about climate change. And I think theirs is the future that's going to be most affected by all of that we've talked about tonight. So let me stop there. I've been yakking at you way too long. I'd be happy to take your questions on any subject. We can talk about climate change, or if you have some political questions about Indonesia or stuff like that, I'm happy to talk as well.
I'll take the microphone if you just wait till I acknowledge you, please. Thank you very much, Bob. And I'll bring around the microphone if you just raise your hand, Gordon.
This is quick. Will we have access to your slides that we can share
Larry's
with
got
our
them. Larry's
families?
got them. You got them all. Please.
So great talk. So you were talking about the need for a market, and I know we don't yet have a market.
For carbon.
Yeah, carbon market.
Yeah.
But you mentioned Brazil, and if I recall, this could be a faulty memory, but there was a time when the U.S. forgave debt as a sort of payment for all the green, all the air that Brazil protects for us using the Amazon. So couldn't the U.S. do something like that for Indonesia, for example, or other countries? I mean, it would be great if there was a global market, but there's not a global market. So
generally those things work where the debt that is owed is deeply discounted because the countries are not paying their debt. And so mostly Brazil and others are in a fairly good financial condition now, so so there's not deep discounts on their debt, and so it's not as interesting. But it's groups like the World Wildlife Fund that I also work with are actually doing some really creative financing like that to figure out swaps of various kinds that will end up preserving forests and what they're doing is, which is really, really important, they're trying to think about it on a big landscape-wide deal. So The World Wildlife Fund has a huge project in the Amazon that covers something like the state of Massachusetts. I mean, it's a giant, giant program. And it's just that. It's figuring out this huge sort of landscape protected area, working really closely with the indigenous people who live in those places to make sure that they're going to benefit from the money that comes from this. It doesn't just go into some, central government corrupt fund of some sort. So more and more people talk about the importance of working with these indigenous communities. They more than anybody understand, and that includes in our own community, the Native Americans who live in the grasslands in the Midwest and so forth. There's really, really important work being done. So yes, so there is work being done, but it's not on it's not those debt for nature swaps because, right, exactly. But they're in many ways more creative ones than that. And if you're interested, I can send you some information on it. Please.
Hold on.
I don't think there's anybody in this audience who doesn't agree that this is a man-made problem. We created the problem back
Yep.
at the industrial age.
Yep.
Back 10 years ago, a leader of the world, Pope Francis, issued something called the Laudato Si, which was an epistle on global warming.
Yep.
Started out with science and got through that and then ended up with a moral problem that
Yep.
it presents us with. I don't hear much of anything about the moral responsibility that we have. You didn't mention anything about the moral, and it does come up because there are poor countries who say we shouldn't be bothered about this because it's your problem,
Right.
the industrial problem. So why can't we get the moral problem out and say we caused it, we have got to take responsibility for Mother Earth?
Well, I'll answer that in two ways. First of all, the moral problem does come up a lot in our conversations, believe me. So when I was in India, that was the constant refrain that we heard from the Indians was, well, wait a minute, why are you asking us to do this? You're the ones that created all these problems. You're the ones that not only should be taking the action, but you should be compensating us to do this. The problem with that is we just don't have the money for that. So people like John Kerry have not wanted to go down that rabbit hole because it's a never-ending, and that's a lot of why there was for so long it was impossible to create a loss and damage fund, because the developing countries were saying not only do we want compensation for what's going on right now, we want compensation for all the past damage that's being done, which of course would have run into the trillions of dollars, and no country has those kinds of resources to pour into that. So. Kerry, in other words, just said, look, we can't, it's politically impossible for us. We can't even get $1 billion right now for you, much less $1 trillion for past sins. So that's why this has sort of been a little bit gently pushed aside, the whole moral case. I will say, when we talk about the word just energy transition partnerships, there really is a much greater focus now on how do you help. So in Indonesia, the just piece of this was, all right, we're going to transition very large communities who are entirely dependent on coal, not only for coal exports, but coal to power much of Indonesia. If we're asking them to suddenly stop not only producing coal, but using it of any kind, that's going to put massive numbers of people out of work. So there's got to be a really spectacularly detailed program to figure out how to retrain those people. And a lot of them, let's be honest, they're uneducated. Most of them have never even been through primary school. You're not going to train them to be a digital entrepreneur. So some of those are going to have to be retrained into maybe become fishermen or farmers. But even that, you've got to create, they've got to find land. I mean, there's just, you name it, there's major work that has to be done. So at least there's a recognition now in these just energy transition partnerships that a lot of these communities cannot be forgotten, and something's got to be done to help them. And indeed, we're finding that in our own country as well, that the auto workers in the Midwest, for example, who were put out of work as when we signed originally the NAFTA and now the MCA, they had to be retrained, and it was a difficult process, and that's the failure of that process, in a way, has animated a lot of Donald Trump's success and other successes.
So natural gas has been, well, 20 years ago it was touted as the bridge fuel, and that
Yep.
was going to get us to, a cleaner future. And then we had fracking, and,
Yep.
and the U.S. became this great big producer of natural gas. So where does everybody stand on it now? Is it a bridge too far now, or what's happening
It's a
with natural
source
gas?
of enormous controversy, even within the administration, which is very much committed to climate change. And there are people within the administration who think, A, we have to continue to develop our own resources, and this is, the world depends on and we're one of the largest exporters of LNG now. And there are others who say, no, wait a minute. Here we are lecturing all these other countries about how they've got to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels. And meanwhile, we've become one of the largest producers and exporters of fossil fuels ourselves. So we're kind of talking out of both sides of our mouths here. So I think if you were to ask John Kerry that question, he would say that he believes that we need to transition out of fossil fuels altogether. And yes, LNG can be a temporary answer, but LNG we should not be entering into long-term LNG contracts that are going to go on for the next 30 or 40 years that are going to have, just keep us dependent on fossil fuels for a very, very long time to come. So he's more of a purist on this, and he should be, because he's the one who's out there telling everybody else that they need to do the same thing. But I can tell you it's a very controversial issue within the administration to this date. And that's why they've had a hard time with a lot of these big LNG projects about should they approve it. And the other one, the big one, is some of the big oil exploration projects in Alaska, the Willow Project and others. And again, the president took major heat from the environmental community for approving that. But it was very, very important to Alaskans in terms of raising incomes and economic opportunity for them. So you're always trying to figure out that appropriate balance. My own view is if we can continue to make the math work by continuing with the deployment of renewables and electric vehicles and others and still stay within our 2050 target, that's fine. But people are worried that we're not going to, that if these new LNG projects come online, the math won't work.
I think we have time for one more question. I saw one over here.
So these agreements and arrangements, are they enforceable? And is there legislation before the arrangements or after the arrangements here in the United States specifically?
Nothing is enforceable overseas, and that's part of the problem. So all these commitments that are made in all these COPs they're just stuff on paper. And that's what Kerry's been complaining about. And that's why you really need somebody out there pushing every country to say, okay, you committed to this. What are you doing? What's your plan? And how can we help, most importantly? And in the United States, at least, we have a very strong think tank community and environmental community and others to hold the government accountable to really make sure that whatever commitments we made are actually going to be implemented. But in many parts of the world, and where Larry and I have worked for many years, the civil society is not very strong, and the government has really made pretty good effort to constrain them and to restrict their scope of activities. And so it's much harder, and therefore governments are not held to the same level of account. And so it's a problem. So that's why having a special envoy like Kerry out there, really, he doesn't care if they're autocrats or whatever. He goes in and talks to all of them and says, and he's got this simple message, which is, at the end of the day, everybody's going to have to explain what's going to happen, and we ourselves will hold other people to account and explain to the world who's doing what they're supposed to be doing and who isn't. And I think that's one of the real beauties about him, is because he had this incredible Rolodex and this incredible access to people, he could get in to see the bad guys of the world and talk to them in a straight way that very few other people can. And so we'll miss that side of him.
Well, please join me in thanking Ambassador Blake.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. See you on the 22nd of February. Good night.